Well, welcome everyone. My name is Doug Dahman. I'm the educational coordinator at the Civil War Museum in Kenosha, Wisconsin, and I'd like to welcome you to our December version of the Second Friday Lecture. With us today is Joanne Daly Carr, and as you can see from our screen, the title of her program today will be Such Anxious Hours, Wisconsin's Women's Voices from the Civil War. For those of you who might be viewing the program for the first time, the Second Friday Lecture Series extends back 12 years, really from the life and inception of the Civil War Museum in Kenosha. For the first 11 or 12 years that the program was being offered, this was something that you would travel to the museum and see our programming live and in person. But with the pandemic and remaining socially distant, we've transitioned to our Zoom platform, recording them and for playback on Facebook Live. So we're able to broadcast this all over the country, really all over the world, and we've been able to bring in speakers from all over the country as well. So in some ways, it's kind of expanded our reach and our voice across the country. What hasn't changed is the continuing sponsorship by the Milwaukee Civil War Roundtable and Iron Brigade Association of the Second Friday Lecture Series. We thank them for their continued support, and we look forward to offering these as the year turns into 2021. I would invite everyone out there to keep an eye on our the Civil War Museum's website. You'll see the advertisements for the programs that we have coming up in January, February, and March very soon. But today we're very excited to have Joanne Daly Carr with us. This is the culmination of a lot of planning. Joanne was going to join us for our Homefront seminar last April, but unfortunately we had to postpone that. So she was kind enough to transition to this platform and do the program virtually for us. Joanne had a career in library services and technology, and after her retirement, she really returned to her roots, her historic research roots, and was able to put together this particular program, which comes from a book of the same title. And I invite you to go to your favorite online bookstore or online resources to find the book. You can find it at any of those and purchase it and get the rest of the story based on today's program. But Such Anxious Hours, Wisconsin Women's Voices from the Civil War, really comes to us from the voices of Wisconsin women on the home front. Those voices had remained largely hidden in libraries and archives, but Joanne was able, through her historic research, to reveal the voices of 8 Wisconsin women whose letters and diaries provide a narrative of the war from the fall of Fort Sumter to the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. These writings not only reflect the everyday lives of these women, but also unmask the ways they were changed and were changed by the Civil War. Joanne, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a long time coming, and I can't thank you enough for doing this with us today.
Thank you, Doug. I'm very anxious to share the stories of these 8 women. The program in April is not the only one that I had to cancel or postpone, so it was good to reacquaint myself with these women because I've been social distancing from them as well during the pandemic. April 15th, 1861. News came this morning that Fort Sumter had been taken by Southern forces under General Beauregard. It caused a great deal of excitement here, though it had been daily expected for some time. War seemed inevitable, and everyone seems to be willing to do their best in the country's service. Patriotism is a great ingredient of Northern blood, and I think our country has nothing to fear in regard to the loyalty of her sons and daughters. These words were written by Emily Quiner in a journal which she would maintain from the news of the fall of Fort Sumter until late September 1863. Doug, it's not advancing again. Let me see. Emily Quiner is among the 8 Wisconsin women whose voices are reflected in my book. As Doug mentioned, the voices of these women have largely been hidden. I looked at over 2,000 records of collections in libraries and archives. of letters from the Civil War. From that, I selected 30 collections where women's voices were reflected, and I chose these 8 women because they were ordinary women ranging in age from 18 to 43 who provide a somewhat diverse perspective of Wisconsin during the Civil War. Unfortunately, because of the small population of people of color, was not able to locate any resources by women of color written during the Civil War. But these 8 women, Emily Quiner, Annie Cox, Ann Waldo, Susan Brown, Margaret MacNish Patchin, Sarah Jane Gates Powers, Mary Swannell Burwell, Rosabella Augusta Arnold, reflect, as I said, a fairly wide age span. They lived in the capital city of Madison, in small towns, and on farms. Some had close family members who went to the front, others did not. But all of them kept records that gave an inkling of what the Civil War was like for them. 2 of my young women were from Madison. Emily Quiner and Annie Cox were both 21 years old when the war began. They lived 3/4 of a mile from one another in the capital city of Madison. They attended some of the same events because they wrote about them or had other archive materials in their archives from those events. And even though I like to think of them passing as ships in the night, they never mention one another in their writings. I think that reflects the different experiences and perspectives that they have. Emily's diary provides the longest sustained account in my book, starting in April of 1861 and continuing until September 1863. It also provides an in-depth look at the life of a upper middle class woman in 19th century Madison. Her father was secretary to the governor. Her diary is replete with accounts of social events and of her strong commitment to the temperance movement. But once the war began, Emily's attention turned to relief work. Emily's work for the war effort included working with many other women. May 4th, 1861, went with Ma and Fanny to the assembly chambers. It was crowded and presented a busy spectacle. There were 10 sewing machines in operation. We met again in the evening and altogether finished about 13 dozen today. Emily not only did sewing, but she and her friends formed their own Young Ladies' Aid Society. This was one of many, many ladies' aid societies in Wisconsin. Over the course of the war, Wisconsin Ladies' Aid Societies provided over 6,000 boxes of supplies to the battlefront. Excuse me. Emily continued her work supporting the soldiers, and she was very busy with it, but she was also intent on events at the battlefront. February 17th, 1862. This morning, we received official accounts of the taking of Fort Donelson by our troops and the capture of 15,000 rebels. It caused great rejoicing here. 34 guns were fired. This reference to 34 guns being fired in celebration of events continues many places in Emily's diary. As far as the Northerners were concerned, there had been 34 states in the Union during the election of 1860, and despite the attempts at secession, 34 states remained. Emily was a school teacher in a one-room school in the town of Madison for a short time. After that, she visited a number of cities and towns around Madison looking for a new teaching job. And she also attended the State Teachers Convention in July 1862. At the conclusion of the meeting, Emily and others decided to visit some of the sites around the town. July 31st, 1862. Cool and pleasant this morning. When the afternoon session of the association was over, we, that is a number of us, went to visit the high school building, climbed up several hundred steps to the observatory, where we had a fine view for our pains. This is the view from the high school observatory during Emily's visit in 1862. Emily was also a student at the university and was one of the first 75 women to be admitted. In 1862, the university opened their enrollment fully to women because they faced a crisis of enrollment. Young men, in the words of Governor Solomon, exchanged the musket and sword for books and studies. Emily delighted in her studies at the university, in contrast to the feelings of the other young Madison woman in my book. March 27th, 1863, Annie Cox writes, Mr. Allen is nicely settled in the south building on the hill with his school. There are some 100 scholars. The students don't like it very well, I guess. How I wish I could go, but I want to do my little all to help father get a home of his own. If I had obeyed my own father, I would have been at school long since, and everything at my command. Yet, how much happier I am. Annie Cox had been a student at Lawrence University prior to the war, but because of a conflict between her stepfather and her biological father, she had left school. And instead of spending her time studying or school teaching or doing work, relief work, Annie's also had a desire for a home of her own. For she bore responsibility as a housekeeper in the boarding house where her family lived. Annie's letters are to Gideon Winans Allen, and she spent much of her time in the historical rooms overlooking the Capitol building that were at that time housed in the Baptist Church. I like to imagine Annie in this serene environment writing her letters to Winans. Annie and Winans were alike in many ways. They both came from difficult backgrounds. They both loved nature, and they were both very intelligent. However, there was one large difference between them. Annie was an avid abolitionist, and Winans sympathized with the South. His political leanings led him to leave the University of Wisconsin to attend the University of Michigan Law School. The University of Michigan was one of the few northern institutions that increased in enrollment during the war. The University of Michigan did this because they were known as a center for Copperheads, the Northerners who supported the Southern cause. Because of this difference, politics was a central feature of many of Annie's letters. February 1st, 1863. The insane were Republicans. The keeper and outsiders were Democrats. Our imprisonment showed the triumph of the Democrats and their insanity on the emancipation question. I cannot help but think that Democrats' support of countenance of slavery thereby crushed free speech, thought, and action. We never could espouse an honest opinion in the South if contrary to this peculiar institution. This is Annie's interpretation of her dream in which she had been imprisoned for anti-slavery ideas. I find it interesting that Annie, like other writers, capitalizes the word Republicans, but gives no such honor to the word Democrats. Annie was an aspiring artist as well as a lover of nature. Among her papers at the Newberry Library in Chicago is this sketch of the Lake Mendota shoreline. It will be an autumn scene, thus highly colored. Her pursuit of art was born both of her love for art and of nature, and of her need to earn money. In October 1863, she wrote, I have made an agreement to take lessons in coloring. I commence tomorrow. I am glad to turn the world over. He is in Fuller's gallery. I took my first lesson this morning. Must go again this afternoon. He charges from $8 to $10 a piece for them. Zounds, I'll be rich if I succeed. 73 miles north of Madison, another young woman was facing a war much different than that faced by Emily and Annie. 26-year-old Ann Waldo and her 5-year-old daughter Della went to live with Ann's sister, Susan Brown, when Anne's husband, Morris Waldo, enlisted in the Wisconsin Cavalry. December 21st, 1861. Well, here I am in Winneconne. I came here last Tuesday, and a beautiful day it was, nearly as warm as May, but the dullest, desolate place was ever in. It is even worse than it used to be. Anne and Morris had indeed met at Susan's home in Winneconne, but they had lived in Ripon since then, and that larger community was much more to Anne's liking. Anne and Susan were two women who had already led a very challenging life by the time the war began. When their mother died when the girls were very young, Anne was 1, Susan was 6, their new stepmother treated the sisters with such cruelty and neglect that 6-year-old Susan was made responsible for the care of her 1-year-old daughter. Susan was a very intelligent and talented girl, and she traded assisting her classmates with their homework for food and clothing for her baby sister. This relationship of caretaker and the one being cared for continued throughout their life. Anne's flirtatious nature and deep love for her husband shines through her letters, as shown in this letter of December 8th, 1861. I suppose if I should take a peep at you today, I should see you strutting about in your new uniform. I should be very happy to see you even without anything on. Anne's disappointment with the social scene in Winneconne and her deep longing for her husband led her to make the 133-mile trip from Winneconne to Camp Harvey at Kenosha, so she could spend time with Morris before he left the state. Her sudden and apparently unplanned departure was referenced by Susan when Susan wrote to Anne in February 1862. I was somewhat surprised to hear that you are well at Kenosha and presume you enjoy yourself finely. My school was out last Wednesday week, since which time I have been busy sewing. I was intending to go to Ripon next week with Mr. Tucker's team and have you to keep house, but it seems that was a miscalculation. In her next letter to Anne, Susan asked if Morris would be able to provide money to help the Brown-Waldo household, and encourages Anne to return to Winneconne in time to take a teaching position. By June, Anne had returned to Winneconne and was writing letters to Morris in Missouri. But that fall, Morris fell ill, and Anne once again left to take care of her husband, this time leaving her daughter Della in care of her sister Susan. That decision of Anne to go to Missouri to nurse her husband back to health changed the lives of the Waldo and Brown families. Margaret MacNish Patchin, at 43, is the oldest woman in my book. She was pregnant with her 8th child when the war began. Her first three children had died many years before the war, but she and her husband Augustus farmed near Wyacina, Wisconsin, with their sons James, John, Orlo, and Albert. When Augustus enlisted in 1863, Margaret, a very shy and insecure woman, was responsible not only for the care of baby Herbert and for her older sons, but also for managing their farm. Margaret depended on Augustus, calling him my all, and at first seemed to be bewildered that he had left her. March 6, 1863. Oh, it is hard to think that I had an influence over you to keep you at home, but may God keep my much-loved husband from all dangers and permit you to soon come home to me. Although Margaret grew in many ways during the war, she still remained most comfortable when she stayed on the farm with her family. However, in June 1863, she reported to Augustus, I have been very unwell for a few weeks, and I thought at first that I couldn't go to Portage to see that doctor. But after a hearty cry over it, I plucked up courage and went. And this is the Portage that Margaret plucked up courage to go to in 1863. As the war progressed, Margaret's writing became more confident, and she began to take pride in her innovation in farming. In August of 1863, she happily reported on her acquisition of a patent beehive and hoped that this self-protective beehive would enable the farm to make more money. The next woman in my book, Sarah Jane Powers, had been married to her husband, Norman, for 6 years when the war began. As was common for many women during the war, Sarah moved away from their farm in Fox Lake to live with her parents while Norman was away. She moved with their 3 children. This adjustment from Fox Lake to Fond du Lac was quite a big one for Sarah. Fox Lake was a community in which the Powers family had good roots, and it only had 1,400 people. In contrast, Fond du Lac was the major trading center for the Fox Valley, boasted a population of 5,547, and had grist mills, a post office, 4 elementary schools, and a high school. Very few of Sarah's letters survived the war, but those that did are among the most poignant ones that I read. Sarah's letters were sent between June 18th and August 11th, 1863, as Norman lay wounded and ill in a military hospital in Milkins Bend, Louisiana. For almost 6 weeks, Sarah was uncertain of Norman's fate after the battle at Fort Gibson and sought information on his fate from their friends in Fox Lake. As was true for many, many communities, the Fox Lake soldiers were all in the same regiment. From these soldiers' families, Sarah learned of the battles of Jackson, Champion Hill, and Big Black River, Mississippi, and also learned from them, not from the Army, that Norman was hospitalized at Milkins Bend, Louisiana, with a slight wound to his finger. At first, she was optimistic, for she thought the wound had saved him from the other battles. In this letter, in which she talks about the slight wound saving him, she also expressed a hope to Norman that I most patiently wait for the interesting hours we will have when you do return. Sarah continued to write to Norman, sending at least 1 letter a week. She reported on the use of a mechanized reaper for their farm because she was continuing to go back to the farm to check on things, on the longing their children felt for him, and reported on war news. The use of mechanized reapers and other equipment grew during the war. There were fewer individuals around who could be farmhands, and so mechanical uses of tools for farming became more prevalent, leading to the development of major firms in Milwaukee, such as Alice Chambers and I.I. Hayes. The report on war news was also something that occurred in a number of the women's letters. For the soldiers who were in one arena of the battlefield would not hear what was happening in the other arenas as frequently as the people back at home did. And of course, children everywhere were longing for their fathers during this time. In one of his letters to her, Norman had shared his hopes that he would be granted a furlough and be allowed to come home to complete his recovery. So Sarah wrote to him, I shall look for you until the middle of next month, for the surgeon might as well let you recover at home as they're living in the hospital. Despite Sarah's constant efforts in writing to her Norman, he did not receive any letters from her after May 30th. His letters shared his loneliness, despair, and fears. His letters to Sarah also indicated that he was indeed suffering from diarrhea and fever. When Norman reported the large number who had died since being hospitalized, Sarah's admonition that the surgeon would be cruel if Norman were not allowed to recover at home rang true. Frustrated that Norman had not received her letters when she had written at least once per week, Sarah directed her next letter to his doctor instead of to the regiment. In this letter, she again urged him to come home, shared news of Gettysburg and Vicksburg, and detailed her pride in their children. She closed her letter with the request, Norman, if you receive this, write as soon as possible. Sarah's last surviving letter to Norman was written on August 8th, hoping to hear that he had finally received a letter from her and that her letter to him would find him growing in health. But Norman was not growing in health. He had succumbed to malaria on July 30th. It is with sorrow that I inform you of the death of your husband, Norman Powers. He had good care, and all that could be done for him was done. Enclosed in this letter is $1.90. That is all the money he had when he died. His knapsack and uniforms was sent to the headquarters of this hospital. I expect they will be sent home. As J.G. Dunning anticipated, Norman's knapsack and clothing were returned to Sarah. The Army also returned the letters that Sarah had written to Norman in the 6 weeks before his death. Norman died without knowing of Sarah's love, concern, and growing frustration that had led him to feel so abandoned in his time of need. For all of Sarah's letters were returned to her unopened. Mary E. Swannell and Andrew Burwell's story had a much happier ending. Mary and Andrew were married shortly after the war began, and when Andrew enlisted in 1863, Mary also moved from their farm to live with her parents. She moved from their farm near Endeavor to Packwaukee, but continued to make frequent trips to her and Andrew's farm outside Endeavor as she worked to sustain the farm during the almost 2 years that Andrew was away from home. Mary and Andrew were blessed to be surrounded by two loving families, and their support for Mary and Andrew shined through Mary's letters. Mary took great delight in their young daughter, Lucy, and shared stories of Lucy's ventures in learning to walk and to talk. Lucy soon learned that the letters her mother cherished were from Papa, and Lucy would toddle around their home, kissing the letters, since that was the primary image she had of her absent father. Mary was a very unselfish young woman who was deeply in love with her husband and did everything she could to keep him warm and safe while he was away. She knit him socks and sent precious pipe tobacco to him. But when Andrew secured a position as the cook for the officers, Mary found one more way that she could help Andrew. Both Mary and Andrew felt that being cook was a safer position because he was not sent to the front of the battlefield. So a number of her letters contained detailed instructions for some of Mary's favorite recipes in hopes that being well fed would keep the officers happy, keep Andrew as cook, and keep Andrew far away from the front lines. October 30th, 1864. When you have chicken, you can cut them up and wash them clean and put them in your kettle to boil and add some salt in when you part them over and skims come. And when they are done, stir up a little flour and make a gravy. Mother says if you can get some Williams baking powder, that will be handy for you. You take 2 tablespoons of the powder and stir it good in your flour, and take a pint of water and a little salt and a little butter, if you have it, and mix your dough and bake it. I don't know how you manage to bake. Mary, as I said, deeply loved her husband, and she often ended her letters with poetry, which I believe are her original writings. I miss you so in our cottage home when the daylight cares are over, as I sit and watch the stars come out where we often sat before. And I listen in vain for thy welcome step. How I long to hear it once more. Rosabella Augusta Arnold is the youngest woman in my book. She was a 17-year-old typesetter in Berlin, Wisconsin when the war began in 1861. She lived in Berlin with her mother and brother and became friends with Charles Bennett Palmer, who was also an employee of the Berlin Current. When Charles enlisted in the cavalry in 1863, he began receiving letters from quite a number of young women from Berlin. He was a very popular young man. Both Charles and Belle were very sociable individuals. Belle loved gossip and participating in events with her wide circle of friends. In one of her earliest letters, Belle reflects being a carefree teenager, happy to report on George, their shared nemesis at the newspaper, and to share news of social events with their mutual friends. November 12th, 1863. We had a surprise up to Roxy's last night. All met at Tripp's at 8 o'clock and went from there together. There were nearly 25, if not quite. So you see, we have an addition to our clique. We have a good time. Apples, ciders, and cakes of all descriptions were in attendance. How I wish you had been here. Her first letter also contains a brief reference to their friend Hi. I see Hi occasionally. He is not in town much of the time. In June 1864, Belle married Hiram Sleeper. And shortly after their marriage, Hiram existed. Belle's life changed dramatically. As a married woman, she could no longer work at the Current. She could no longer participate in social activities with her unmarried friends. And as a new wife, she was soon called away from her beloved Berlin to nurse her mother-in-law back to health in the small town of Brooklyn. To add to Belle's worries and the change in her life, in September 1864, Hiram was captured and sent to Salisbury Prison in North Carolina, one of the most brutal of the prisoner of war camps. Belle waited anxiously for word from Hiram, even writing letters to prisoners who had been released or escaped from Salisbury. In the course of a year, her life changed from carefree girlhood to an adulthood filled with burdens and worry. February 6, 1865. I must not neglect to tell you of the 3 letters that I have received from Hiram. Although they were of so ancient a date, the last was written October 13th, and he was to leave the next day for Salisbury, North Carolina. She continues, A.D. Richardson, correspondent of the New York Tribune, has lately escaped from Salisbury, and I have written him to learn, if possible, some things concerning my husband. I mean to write Abe Lincoln pretty soon, if you don't hurry up the exchange of prisoners. As my entire book shows, letters to and from the home front were critically important to the soldiers, their families, and friends. Belle expresses how important these letters were, because as her desperate hope to soon receive letters from Hi and the anticipation of him being released to come back to her is the focus of some of her last letters to Charlie. March 16, 1865. I must close now and go down to the post office. The mail does not come in now until 8 o'clock, and this makes it very late for me to go to the P.O., but I can't stay until morning. To think of letting a letter remain there all night drives me out. Much darker nights than this. Belle had also returned to Berlin because her mother-in-law had recovered, and Belle felt a deep need to be in the community where she and Hi had been married. I would not be contented so far from town. It is here my husband will come first, and I must be among the first to greet him. In April 1865, most of the women in my book were able to rejoice in the end of the war, as they could hope that their husbands, sons, brothers, and friends would now return to them. After Annie Cox and Gideon Winans Allen had become engaged, they made a pledge that they would no longer discuss politics, as it was causing too much conflict between them. However, Annie could not resist sharing her joy at the end of the war. April 9th, 1865. Jeff Davis has gone to Augusta and would attempt to carry on his government there. But the latest news is that he has been captured with his army. The hills sang out merrily and the cannons boomed. When the war ended, the women whose voices have been revealed in this book ventured forth into lives diminished by loss and bereavement, but also into a world that had been enriched by the contributions they and countless other women had made during the war. They also were impacted by the changes that the war had brought to this country. Emily Quiner was one of the first women to complete her degree at the University of Wisconsin and had a 30-year career as a school teacher in Chicago and in Denver. Annie and Winon's daughter, Ruth, was the first woman to complete a doctorate in botany at the university, a field of study that may have been inspired in part by her mother's love of nature. Late in life, Susan Brown was at last relieved from the responsibilities that she had carried from the age of 6. And in an unpublished autobiography, writes of the great pride that she took in traveling cross country on all 4 transcontinental railroads. Margaret built upon her success with the Patchin beehive by working with her husband and sons to transition their farm from wheat to dairy farming. And all of these women made one other major contribution to the world in which we live today. Their writings, although not meant to be shared with a wider audience, have given us a greater appreciation and a greater understanding of the contributions and sacrifices that were made by Wisconsin women during the Civil War. Thank you.
Well, Joanne, I want to thank you for your presentation. I have a couple of questions for you. I was taking notes during the. Do you mind if I ask you a question or two? You mentioned a few of the sources for some of the letters. Annie Cox's were at the Newberry Library. Where else did you find these other collections? What repositories? Were they in private hands or were they in library or museum collections? Where did you find them?
The Cox Allen papers are at the Newberry Library. The Patchin papers are at the Wisconsin Veterans Museum. The Mary and Andrew Burwell's letters, strangely enough, are at the University of Southern Mississippi. And all of the other letters were at the Wisconsin Historical Society archives or library. The Powers letters are actually in the library because the Powers descendants compiled the letters, which also enabled me to learn a little bit about Sarah after the war.
I was interested to hear the story of Anne and Morris Waldo. You mentioned that Morris served in the 1st Wisconsin Cavalry and that he was sent here to Kenosha to Camp Harvey to train. Now, we just had an exhibit that just came down that detailed all of the comings and goings of the 1st Wisconsin Cavalry. They were here in Kenosha from about November 24th until March 17th of 1862. So they wintered here in town. And a lot of the men came without necessary blankets, winter gear, gloves, etc., to survive the winter. And the officers of the regiment really made an appeal to the local citizens of Kenosha to outfit the troops with proper stuff. Did you get any sense of Morris's time here in Kenosha? Did he mention anything about the city or the camp itself or the experiences of the soldiers?
There was not a great deal from Morris when he was in Kenosha because Anne missed him greatly, and so went with her daughter Della to stay in Kenosha during part of his time there. There was one interesting exchange where he was discussing camp followers who would wait outside the gates of Camp Harvey, and he and Anne had a few words about that. Yes. He did not really go into many details about the privations that he was experiencing.
And you mentioned that Morris got sick in St. Louis and that Anne traveled there. You kind of left
Yes.
us with a cliffhanger that you said this would forever change their lives. Is that something that people will have to find the book and read the book to get an answer to, and if that's the case, I fully respect that. But
Well, I mean, it is a historical fact, but Anne did not return from Missouri.
oh,
And so her daughter Della remained with Susan until after the war, when Morris could return. And so it was a sacrifice that Anne made. She is the only woman in my book who actually died as a result of the war. She caught the, while nursing Morris, she also became ill and is buried in Missouri.
yeah. Yeah, I think that's a great point, that for these women that went to these hospitals with, they were just as susceptible to these diseases as any of the soldiers. And we certainly know that, the camp life for any Civil War soldier was obviously the most dangerous part of their service. Two-thirds of the men who died during the Civil War, didn't die of wounds or bullets or shrapnel. They died of simple diseases like diarrhea and dysentery and the things that you described. So she certainly wouldn't have been immune to that as well.
Norman Powers died of malaria. Emily Quiner also spent some time as a nurse, and she has many, many heartfelt entries about caring for her boys and how little they were able to do to help them survive minor illnesses and minor wounds. One of the young men that Emily Quiner cared for had injured his finger when a splinter got in it when he was bowling, and succumbed to that wound. So the terrible conditions of the hospitals are certainly revealed in the women's writings as well.
Well, Joanne, thank you so much for sharing these stories with these 8 incredible women and their letter collections. And I'm so glad that we were able to finally make this happen. And I invite everyone out there, once again, to go out and check out, see if they can find the book, Such Anxious Hours, Wisconsin Women's Voices from the Civil War. We look forward to having you in person, getting you down here to do another program in the future. And we thank you so much for your time this afternoon.
Thank you so much, Doug. It's been a pleasure.
It's very nice to meet you. Take care.
Thank you.